About a year ago, I showed you a video of me pruning a Scots Pine. I'm going to show a link to it here, and I'm going to show you right here what it used to look like a year ago, where we left off with it. I wanted to do an update on that video, show you what I've been up to with that tree over the last few months here, and show you why I made those decisions in order to help you to understand a little bit more about bonsai design. Let's take a look at it. So this is what the tree looks like now. And as you can see right off the bat, it looks really different from the way we left it a year ago. I've made some radical design changes, and let me explain why I did what I did and how I did it. First of all, let's start in the back here and look at this root. Last year when I was just sort of getting to know this tree, I noticed that there was a large root that was sort of sticking up out of the dirt a little bit. And I wasn't quite sure what was there, and I wanted to know if it was something that I could incorporate into the design. So I took the tree out of the pot and sort of cleared out some of the dirt, and quickly discovered that it had this enormous root that had formed while it was just, growing in a pot somewhere. And not only is it huge, but it had curved over like this all on its own, in order to conform to the shape of the pot that it was in. So it was sort of smushed in and had to contort itself like this in order to fit. And I quickly thought to myself, gosh, I have got to incorporate that root into the design somehow. So what I decided to do was to do what I had talked about doing in that video. If you go back and watch it, I had talked about maybe changing the design from being an upright tree that was leaning this way, but upright, and instead tilting it maybe 40 degrees downward from where it was. And that's what I decided to do with this. In order to take advantage of this root, what I needed to do was tilt the whole tree over so as to make this root, instead of being down in the pot, stick up into the air. I eliminated some of the minor roots that were coming off of it, and then I just repotted it into this large kind of training pot. I decided not to try to make this fit into a bonsai pot this year, because I'd already done a fair amount of work last year. This year I did a whole lot more pruning and and I cut off a lot of roots just in order to expose this root. So I really didn't want to mess with it any further and stress it out. So I left the rest of the roots intact and put it into a fairly large training pot here. So maybe next year, at some point later next year, in fall or something like that, I may decide to get rid of the rest of the roots and try to fit it into a small pot. The other reason why I want to keep the roots, though, is because I wanted to have as much energy stored up at the end of this year, so that next spring that it has a lot of energy prepared to put into creating new needles. Because this year I did a lot of pruning back and a lot of reshaping, and I'm going to hope for some vigorous growth next year to really take advantage of the new structure that I've laid out. So let's move on from the back side to the front side. I've done a number of things to the front here. If you recall in the video, I showed you that I had left a lot of the branches, basically they were pointing upward, which at this point is actually now downward. So these branches were facing upward before, and now they're pointed downward after I shifted the angle of the trunk. So what I've done since then is I have taken a lot of wire to these branches and directed all of the branches in a downward direction. Okay, pine trees just generally, they tend to look best when you have aimed their branches, particularly the lower ones, downward to a significant degree. It gives them an old, aged appearance that has a lot of character to it. And it's not just the main branch that needs to be bent downward, it's also all of the smaller branches. And so I've been working on shaping these through wiring, mostly to direct them downward. And so as you can see, for the most part, most of these branches are now pointed horizontally, right? Because of the way I've been bending them in different directions. That's not a great look for the tree, and it's not terribly natural, but it's temporary. Because what's going to happen is that next year, as it puts out new growth, those new candles are going to grow in an upward direction, because they know which way the sun is. They will all start pointing upward with their new growth. Now, if I didn't like that, I could technically wire these little branches differently. I could go to the trouble of wiring them all sort of downward and then curving up the tips so that they all point upward, which is ultimately where we're going to want them to be. But I didn't bother to go through all that trouble, because that's a lot of work to do all that wiring. So I may just wait until next year for the new growth to start turning upward and go from there. So I've done a lot of work on all the branches, like I said, pointing them downwards. This big branch here that extends out from the main trunk, if you can see it. So this is really a branch, and this one was pointed a lot more higher upward, and it just didn't look right to me. Notice that the line of the trunk now kind of gradually goes in a downward direction. It's a gradual downward curve. And this branch was actually kind of more up. And I wanted the line of the trunk to kind of continue in the direction that it was going in order to look its best. And I thought that would look better. So what I had to do in order to get this branch to move lower was, I couldn't just wire it lower, because it's such a thick branch that wiring it just wasn't going to work for me. I couldn't bend it down far enough with just wire. So what I had to do was a little surgery on the branch, and what I used are these tools. These are called trunk splitters, oddly enough. And as you can see, trunk splitters work by having two blades that come together. Actually, one blade slightly overlaps the other blade to create a clean cut, and so that the actual blades don't touch and sort of, pound each other flat. One blade has to slightly fit over the other blade. And trunk splitters are useful for splitting trunks. You can also use them for other things. You can help them to make cuts, other branch cuts. But what I was using them for was I would take the trunk splitters around the middle of the trunk, of the branch here, and then just squeeze them tight. And what that does is it creates a cut through the middle of the wood that moves horizontally along the branch. And I did that several times to create a split line horizontally down this branch. Then I did the same thing, so I made another set of cuts going horizontally, but from this angle, from going top to bottom. So the first line of them I did side to side, then I did several cuts top to bottom, so at a 90-degree angle to the first set of cuts, and split it down the branch by about 1.5 inches. And the purpose of that is to break up that wood trunk so that it's easier to bend. And the reason why you can do that safely is because the cambium, the green layer underneath the bark, is still mostly intact, because remember, you're making a surgical incision that goes lengthwise along the trunk, and it's fairly small. It's a small, narrow incision, and so that leaves most of the cambium around the rest of the trunk intact. And so this branch can still get all the water and nutrients that it needs to support these needles out here. So that's what I did. I created these incisions along the branch. That enabled me to make it a little more flexible. I mean, it doesn't make a huge difference. It just helps enough in order for me to then wire it in a lower position. It also has the benefit of helping to make sure that you don't accidentally break the branch in half. I showed you in another video about what can happen when you're bending branches with wire, that they can just break in half. And by creating these splits along the trunk, that makes that less likely to happen. The branch is more flexible. So that's basically where we got to where we are today. What I'm going to do next year is continue this direction. So like I said, I'm going to let the new growth come out. It'll start to go upward, and I'll start to create a foliage pad that has a kind of the appearance of a mound, you know, a foliage mound here and here. This will be the apex of the tree. When designing your tree, you always want to think about where the apex is going to be. That's the top. And this is definitely going to be the top, but I still want it to be largely kind of bent down, because this style that I'm going for here, this is what we call a semi-cascade style, where the tree is leaning downward and all the foliage is kind of drooping downward, but not as dramatically as you would see in a full cascade style tree. So because it's sort of leaning down, it gives the impression that this is a tree that's gone through a lot. It's had a tough time in life. You know, maybe it's located on the edge of a tall cliff somewhere, where it's had to face a lot of you know, difficult weather from storms and high winds, and and all those terrible conditions have sort of forced it downward to protect itself, and all the branches have also kind of drooped down and bent down out of protection, and that gives it a real dramatic kind of look to it, to have all these branches sort of downwardly focused along with the trunk. But we do want them at some point to perk up a little bit and aim upwards, so that we can create a nice mound of needles there, and down here. And we'll do the same thing. This branch, this cluster of branches down here needs some more help. I'll need to do some more wiring at some point here to create the basic branch structure that I want. But this is a good example right here, this branch, of the branch structure that I'm primarily looking for. You can kind of see the pattern, how the branches are arranged so that it looks nice. The branches are all going to be kind of flat, slightly downwardly focused, spread apart, not bunched up too closely, but also not spread apart too far apart. This branch in the back, you can barely see it, but this one I've had to pull back. I decided to bend it backwards so that there's going to be some branch that's pointing towards the back, and not all the foliage pointed towards the front side of the tree, to balance out the front and the back a little bit. Aesthetically, that will, I think, look a little more pleasing. And so that's another long-term goal with this branch, is to develop a foliage pad that points backwards. So those are my ideas right now, and I hope this was informative for you. Let me know what you think and if you have any questions. Oh, and by the way, these trunk splitter, this is a bonsai tool that a lot of bonsai enthusiasts will use, but it's not a necessary tool for getting into bonsai. So if you don't have one of these tools and you don't feel like spending the money on one, that's okay. You don't have to have one. You can definitely get away without using one. And in fact, if you're looking for an alternative to an official bonsai trunk splitter, I have a suggestion for you. Look up horse nippers. Horse nippers are a tool that's used to trim off horse hooves. And I've never used them for this purpose, but as far as I can tell, they're essentially the same tool, and you might be able to get horse nippers more cheaply than an official bonsai tool, which tend to be overpriced. Anyway, hope this was helpful. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.